interrupt your lunch. I just want to get this rolling. I'm Nan He, and a corresponding governor of the club. I'm also part of ProfCom, Professionals Committee, which organizes these events. Can I first ask everyone to switch off their mobile phones? The incredible economic force that China has become has also prompted charges about the nation's empire building around the world. And even though the mainland has repeatedly denied this, such questions remain about China's ambitions. China's continued investments in trade around the world, its maritime activities, Xi Jinping's One Belt, One Road initiative, the mainland's growing trade and influence elsewhere, particularly in various African nations, have continued to fuel much speculation about China's ambitions. Our speaker, veteran journalist and FCC member Toh Han Shih, who is also a senior correspondent at MLEX, revisits this query in his new book, Is China an Empire?, which is available for sale today. Let's hear his observations about China. Everyone, please give a warm welcome to Toh Han Shih.
Thank you, Governor In, for that kind introduction and letting me speak. Thank you to the FCC, and thank you for all coming. I hope you can buy my book, and I'll be happy to sign autographs. Well, basically, the topic of my, the focus of my book is about China's overseas investments. From the opening of China's economy in the 1980s till around maybe 2000, 2010, the big story was foreign investments going into China, and there were all kinds of books that were bullish or bearish about it, saying foreign investors are getting scammed or China's the great next big market. But I think from around 2010 onwards, the situation has reversed, and in my opinion, the big story going forward is China's investments around the world, including some of the countries that formerly invested in China, such as America, Britain, Germany, France, as well as places in Africa and Southeast Asia and Latin America. It is well known that this is part of Chinese President Xi Jinping's vision of One Belt, One Road. Building infrastructure like ports, airports, railway all around the world, connecting China with Central Asia and Africa and Europe. But it is more than just building a road, pouring concrete to build a road in Pakistan, or laying a track in Ethiopia. Going beyond all this hardware and whether it makes sense or no sense at all, it has far greater geopolitical ramifications, which is why my book is about whether China is an empire or not. So let me read excerpts of my book. China in the 21st century bears partial similarities to the British Empire in the 19th century. At first glance, this may be hard to imagine. In the 19th century, Britannia ruled the waves and the sun never set on the British Empire. And for the foreseeable future, China cannot match the Royal Navy. In the two Opium Wars in the 19th century, China was humiliated and defeated by the British. So how can China be like, in the 21st century, be like the British Empire of the 19th century? Nonetheless, China in the 21st century shares similarities with the British Empire in the 19th century in some important respects. In trade, investments, and infrastructure projects, especially railway. China's predominance as the world's biggest trading power in the 21st century mirrors that of the British Empire in the 19th century. Britain was a leading trading nation in the 19th century, buying cotton from America, wool from Australia, copper from Chile, and wine from Portugal. Well, China's doing exactly that these days. Following the footsteps of the British Empire, China surpassed America to be the world's biggest trading nation in 2013. And China's trade has China's the biggest trading partner of more than 120 countries. And China's trade has skyrocketed from 1978 when Deng Xiaoping opened up the economy at 20 billion US to 4.2 trillion in 2013. So it's huge. Yes. The rise of British trade in the 19th century and the rise of Chinese trade in the 21st century both have been driven by industrialization. Britain was the first country to industrialize in the Industrial Revolution. China today is regarded as the world factory, producing a lot of the world's clothes, shoes, sneakers, computer parts, you name it. the Industrial Revolution, the industrialization of Britain caused Britain's GDP to soar tremendously. I mean, Britain's GDP rose from 8.2 billion US dollars in 1830, when it was the third highest GDP in Europe, to 16 billion US dollars in 1860, when it had the highest GDP in the world. And similarly, you know, in a few years ago, China overtook Japan to be the world's second largest GDP, and it's only a question of time before China's total GDP overtakes America. But another similarity between China and Britain is in railways. In the years leading up to 2010, the Chinese government shifted its focus from producing huge quantity of cheap manufacturing goods to infrastructure projects like high-speed railway. Around 2008, China formally launched its high-speed rail program, and by 2012, China has the world's biggest high-speed rail network of over 12,000 kilometers, which costs billions and billions of dollars. Britain, during the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century, underwent a similar transition. The mechanized production of cotton marked the first phase of Britain's Industrial Revolution from 1780 to 1840. But by the mid-19th century, Britain's textile industry had matured, and the second phase of Britain's Industrial Revolution began, which is namely railway, as described in the British Marxist historian Eric Hobsbawm, his book Industry and Empire, The Birth of the Industrial Revolution. I mean, and another British author in his book Unfinished Empire, John Darwin, described the British Empire in those days. Advancing cheap credit, building cheap transport, they drew a growing mass of producers in the Americas, Asias, and Africas into their web. The same thing could be described for China today, where they build expensive infrastructure, even in the poorest countries in the developing world, by offering very cheap credit. And there have been cases of, building a dam in Ethiopia in return for importing beans from that country. The progress of Britain's rail industry encountered bumps along the way. A speculative bubble named the railway mania arose in Britain in the 1840s, when railway shares rose to dizzying heights and then crashed, causing many British families to lose their savings. Yet Britain's huge railway construction was a key to taking the country's industrialization to a more mature phase, argued Eric Hobsbawm. Eric Hobsbawm says that Britain's rollout of railway by accident rather than design was an excellent solution to the crisis of the first phase of British capitalism. I quote Eric Hobsbawm: "Such a vast economic stimulus, coming at the very moment when the British economy was passing through its most catastrophic slump of the century in 1841 and 1842, could have hardly been better timed." This is similar to the Chinese government's 4 trillion renminbi stimulus to counter the global financial crisis in late 2008, which staved off the worst effects of the global financial crisis for China, and basically prevented Hong Kong and the Chinese economy from suffering far worse effects. And this, of course, included the high-speed rail program, which was launched around that time. Between 1830 and 1850, some 6,000 miles of railway were laid in Britain, and the capital cost per mile of rail in Britain was the most expensive in the 19th century, 5 times higher than America. Many of the railways built in Britain made little economic sense, many of them losing money. This mirrors the complaints against the huge cost of the high-speed railway in Hong Kong and mainland China. I mean, there have been many analysts who complained about a high-speed railway to Xinjiang that did not make any economic sense, since no one would ride on them. Uneconomical as it was, railways provided a long-lasting stimulus to the capital goods industries of Britain. The huge expenditure required for British rail construction transformed Britain's capital markets, which offered financial products such as railway bonds. Britain's railway mania of the 1840s produced the stock exchanges of Manchester, Liverpool, and Glasgow. Britain's rail boom resulted in the export of British capital. The improved sophistication of Britain's capital markets facilitated the mobilization of large amounts of capital to fund massive projects and railway projects overseas. Britain was responsible for rail construction boom in Europe, America, and other parts of the world in the latter half of the 19th century, much of it supported by British equipment and contractors. This is a similar situation to China today. Um, yes. And likewise, like in the 19th century Britain, China's industrialization and massive railway development has spurred the sharp rise of Chinese overseas investment. Chinese overseas investments has grown tremendously since the year 2000, when its overseas investments was something like 1 billion US dollars. I think last year, according to Chinese official statistics, it's 160 billion US dollars. And according to the estimates of Deal Logic, in October last year, China overtook America as the world's biggest acquirer of overseas assets at 170 billion US dollars. And I think, according to the Ministry of Commerce, they estimate around 2014 or 2015, the overseas investments going out from China to the rest of the world surpassed the inward foreign direct investments into China. So in the past 1 or 2 years, China became a net exporter of capital. Yes, but you know, China's overseas investments is not without problems. And also in Latin America, for example, I mean, before 2010, there were only 2 Chinese dam projects in Latin America. In January 2014, there were 22. So there's a huge jump. China's massive buildup of infrastructure within China and overseas is not without problems. I mean, in 2010, a Chinese state company, China Rail Construction Company, suffered a net loss of 1.36 billion renminbi because it was building this light rail in Mecca for Muslim pilgrims in Saudi Arabia. A very senior Chinese Politburo member thumped the table and ordered the company to build it in time in October 2010 for the Muslim pilgrimage that year, because he wanted China to maintain a good relationship with Saudi Arabia, which is a major oil supplier. And then there was the high-speed train crash in China in July 2011, when an estimated 40 people were killed and 192 were injured. And also in Venezuela in 2013, China Railway Group suffered delays in its 7.5 billion US dollar railway project in Venezuela because the Venezuelan government at that time didn't have money to pay for it. And of course, in 2011, the Chinese railway minister Liu Zhijin was arrested for taking bribes. However, the problems encountered by Britain in its journey to become the world's rail power in the 19th century, such as in the railway mania and uneconomic railway projects, did not stop Britain from becoming the dominant military and economic power in that era. Naysayers might declare disaster for Chinese infrastructure projects, citing the loss of life, corruption, fraud, huge debts, and difficulties in overseas projects. But as with Britain, such problems will not derail the rise of China as an economic superpower in the 21st century. Now I turn to a book written by Vladimir Lenin on 1916, published in 1916. In 1916, Vladimir Lenin published a book called Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. And I think this is quite pertinent because although China has shed a lot of elements of communism already, the Chinese leaders routinely pay lip service to Lenin. You know, in all the official speeches, they say they subscribe to Marxist-Leninism, etc., etc. And also during the Cold War, the Russians and the Chinese kept accusing the Americans of being imperialists. Now, according to Lenin's book, imperialism has 5 essential features. Number 1, the concentration of production and capital to such a high stage that it creates monopolies which play a decisive role in economic life. Number 2, the merging of bank capital with industrial capital and the creation of a financial oligarchy. Number 3, the export of capital. Number 4, the formation of international capitalist monopolies which share the world among themselves. And number 5, the territorial division of the world among the greatest capitalist powers. The British Empire obviously was what Lenin had in mind, and it had all these features, you know. Lenin's book quotes John Hobson's, a British critic of imperialism. Great Britain grants loans to Egypt, China, Japan, and South America. Her navy plays the part of the bailiff in case of necessity. Great Britain's political power protects her from the indignation of her debtors. China lacks a key element of British imperialism, which is a dominant global navy that can act as a bailiff to protect China from her debtors. Nonetheless, in terms of providing financing throughout the world, China in the 21st century has swapped places with the British Empire in the 19th century. I mean, in the 21st century, Chinese banks are granting loans to Egypt and South America and investing in Britain and Japan. Chinese investments in Europe doubled to a record 18 billion US dollars from 2014 to 2013. And of course, I think in 2015, the Chinese President Xi Jinping visited Britain, where he was given a state banquet by Buckingham Palace, and there were all these complaints that Britain was really kowtowing to China with such lavish displays of obsequiousness. The Chinese have also switched roles with the British as wealthy tourists in Europe, enjoying the fruits of their investments. Lenin again quotes Hobson. In the south of England, in the Riviera, and in Italy and Switzerland, wealthy aristocrats are drawing dividends and pensions from the Far East. Reflect upon the vast extension of such a system, which might be rendered feasible by the subjection of China to the economic control of financiers, investors, officials, draining the greatest potential reservoir of profit the world has ever known, in order to consume it in Europe. The situation has now reserved where wealthy Chinese are buying property in England and the Riviera. By 2012, China ranked second behind Americans as buyer of luxury property in France. Obviously, I mean, on the fifth point of Lenin's imperialism, the territorial division of the world, it is obviously not true because, you don't see America and China conquering and occupying countries. Although one can argue America is more of an imperialist than China in this respect because it has so many military bases around the world. On the fourth point of the international monopolies, this is only partly true of China and America in the 21st centuries. Both companies have huge both countries have huge companies with massive international presence. And if you combine and some of them are near monopoly like Google and Facebook or Microsoft. And if you say you group all the American banks of Wall Street, or if you group all the tech companies like Facebook and Google and Microsoft and Apple together as a group, you can say it's a near monopoly that exerts enormous economic influence around the world. So this is almost true. On the third point, where a hallmark of imperialism is the export of capital, this is true of America and just became true of China. I mean, America used to be the largest global overseas investor, but according to deal logic, China overtook America in late 2016. And about 1 or 2 years ago, as I said earlier, China's overseas investments exceeded the internal foreign investment, so China became a net exporter of capital. As Lenin wrote, imperialism is capitalism in its stage of development, in which the dominance of monopolies and finance capital has established itself, in which the export of capital has acquired pronounced importance. The capital exporting countries have divided the world among themselves in the figurative sense of the term. But finance capital has also led to the actual division of the world. I mean, the two main capital exporting countries in the 21st century, America and China, don't occupy territories around the world, but it can be said to have divided the world among themselves, arguably in the economic sense of the word. The second point is the partnership of banks with industry and the dominance of the financial oligarchy. I mean, as I said earlier, Wall Street, when Wall Street went into recession in 2008, the whole world went down with it, so it goes to show you the enormous influence. And now Chinese banks are getting increasingly influential globally with the billions of dollars of loans they give all over the world in Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. For example, in a speech in January 2006 during the American presidential election, the unsuccessful political candidate Bernie Sanders said, there's a handful of people on Wall Street that have extraordinary power over the economic and political life of our country. Now, the first point is with respect to the production and concentration of production and capital in monopolies. Again, I mean, it's almost true, but not entirely true, because there's competition among different companies. Like You have different Chinese state railway companies that compete with each other, but it's getting increasingly true because the Chinese government just recently merged the two railway train carriage makers into one combined company. So it is getting quite monopolistic. And of course, in America, huge companies like GE, Exxon, Boeing, they have become leading global brands that are near monopolies as well. Yes. Mm. And well, I mean, Lenin wrote also about the union between banks and industry. Um, he quoted the German economist Otto Jadels. Seats on the board are freely offered to persons of title, also to ex-civil servants, who are able to do a great deal to facilitate relationship with the authorities. Usually on the board of a big bank there is a member of parliament or city councillor. This is true of China and America today. I mean, senior directors of Chinese state-owned companies are regarded as Chinese government officials and senior members of the Chinese Communist Party, which is a legacy of China's communist system. But it's also quite true of America. For example, Robert Rubin joined Goldman Sachs in 1966, and then he served as assistant to the president for economic policy in 1993 and 1995, and he was U.S. Treasury Secretary from 1995 to 1999. After leaving office in 1999, Robert Rubin joined Citigroup as a board member. Another example is Timothy Geithner, the U.S. Treasury Secretary from 2009 to 2013. In 2014, Geithner joined the U.S. private equity firm Warburg Pincus as president. Yes. And basically, Lenin also talked about something very interesting. He talked about balance sheet jugglery in joint stock companies, which explains why the boards of directors of these companies are more willing to undertake risky transactions than individual shareholders. Modern methods of drawing up balance sheet not only make it possible to conceal doubtful undertakings from shareholders, but also allow the people most concerned to escape the consequences of unsuccessful speculation by selling their shares in time. You think about Enron and WorldCom. This really recalls a scandal of Enron and WorldCom. Like, for example, Enron chief executive officer Jeffrey Skilling as an example of balance sheet jugglery, where he used a technique called mark-to-market accounting, which values assets based on current market prices. So Enron could write off any loss without hurting its bottom line. And of course, there are too many corruption scandals in China to recount in this short talk. But I mean, one example is the 2003 scandal of the Shanghai tycoon Zhou Zhengyi. As a result of that, Liu Jinpao, the former chief executive of the Hong Kong branch of Bank of China, was dismissed and jailed. This is an example of the collusion between banks and big business described in Lenin. And I think the Asian Infrastructure Bank, Investment Bank, is an example of China's emergence as a net capital exporter. AIIB is, the finance issue institution proposed and led by China, and now has more than 100 members, I believe. And Britain was the first major European nation to join AIIB. Commenting on AIIB, Lawrence Summers, a former U.S. Treasury Secretary and a former economics professor at Harvard University, wrote in his blog, in April 2015, this past month may be remembered as the moment the United States lost its role as the underwriter of the global economic system. I can think of no event since Bretton Woods comparable to the combination of China's efforts to establish a major new institution and the failure of the US to provide dozens of its traditional allies, starting with Britain, to stay out of it. The AIIB is a sign of China's challenge to America in the global financial order. And so towards the end of my book, I also describe this concept of chimerica mooted by these two professors, Moritz Schularik and Neil Ferguson. Chimerica, which is the combination of America and China, and the symbiotic relationship, where I describe this symbiotic economic relationship between China and America, in other words, chimerica, was a key factor that led to the global financial crisis of 2008, where China exported goods very cheaply to America. America bought a lot of, China bought a lot of US treasuries as part of this exporting system. And China's huge purchase of American treasuries kept American interest rates very low. That allowed Americans to sell homes at very cheap loan rates to American home buyers. So when the property market in America crashed, that just created the global financial crisis of 2008. And you know, Neil Ferguson in a paper just after the crash in 2009 said, it's time to put for Chimerica to divorce. But my book argues that China and America are more economically integrated than ever. I mean, Chinese investments are just skyrocketing, in America are just skyrocketing tremendously. According to Rhodium Group, from 2015 to 2016, China's investments in America tripled to something like 46 billion US dollars. And basically, the number of people, the number of jobs created in America on account of Chinese investments was less than 20,000 5 years ago, but now it's exceeded 100,000. So, you know, Donald Trump, as the president of America, keeps talking about creating jobs in America, and Chinese investments is doing just that. And also, the American Chamber of Commerce, I think a few years ago, recently said America desperately needs $8 trillion US dollars of infrastructure spending. And the American Chamber of Commerce specifically welcomed Chinese investments in American infrastructure. And Donald Trump just recently said he's going to launch a $1 trillion US dollar spending program on American infrastructure. So the Chinese, you know, companies are well placed for that because they've got expertise in this infrastructure, and they've also got lots of money in it. And in fact, I just want to quote from one very important passage in let's see now. Yes, quoting from an American professor. Yes. Yes. The rise of Chinese infrastructure construction companies. Yes. Yes. Oh, yes. I want to quote. Yeah, an American professor called John Garver. He has this very interesting insight. Basically, China's ability to build thousands of miles of railway and provide billions of dollars to finance the railway is a killer combination that gives China geopolitical power far beyond simply trade and finance, or far beyond just pouring concrete and laying rail track. Few countries, according to Professor Garver, possibly no other country, can match China's ability to both build infrastructure and provide a huge financing for them. So basically, this enables China to offer a lot of these poor developing countries, make an offer to these poor developing countries, an offer they cannot refuse, like in the movie The Godfather. And you know the Chinese President Xi Jinping, his favorite movie is The Godfather. So I conclude my book saying that in the 21st century, we have two big powers which, for political and cultural and historical reasons, strongly oppose imperialism and fiercely deny they're imperialists, but they have some very important aspects of an imperialist power, although not all of it. So you're having these two, America and China, you have this kind of cooperation and competition, co-opetition, as you say, between two semi-empires. Thank you.
Thanks for that. So I'm going to open this up to the floor. Does anybody have any questions? Please state your name and the organization that you're with. Gentleman at the front.
Thank you very much for your talk. Could you just address the issue of the non-profitability of many of these projects, especially in poor African, Asian developing countries? China is investing heavily. Now, anecdotally, I hear many stories that these projects will never pay back. The countries do not have the financial ability to pay back. The people in those countries are too poor to spend enough to pay back. So please, could I ask, what's China's strategy here? She's prepared to write off that debt as the cost of expanding there, or what is it, economics or politics that drives them?
Both.
Thank you.
I mean, the first thing is a lot of the Chinese companies that are building these infrastructure projects are state companies, so they're told what to do by the government. And as state companies, they're backed by huge amounts of capital and soft loans from state banks. They're not answerable to shareholders every quarter like American listed companies. So they can afford to take the long view. I do not deny there's a certain level of corruption and fraud and wastage in these projects. But on the other hand, there can be real economic benefit. When I was writing about a road highway project in Guangdong province, a manufacturing plant in a little city in Guangdong province told me after the highway was built, the city manufacturing industry just took off tremendously. So there are a lot of fringe benefits to it. Yes, I mean, for example, in September 2009, a former Thai a very former Thai rail official told me he's going to persuade his government not to adopt Chinese high-speed rail because it's too expensive. But nonetheless, I mean, they have this kind of business model. Like I heard that in one of the African countries, I think it was Ethiopia, China would build some multi-billion-dollar dam there, but in return, they could have many, many years of imports of African wheat and grain.
Do we have any more questions? Gentleman at the back.
Tom Holland, Gavcal Research. Thank you very much, Han Shih. I'm curious about your parallel between China today in the 21st century and Great Britain in the 19th century, particularly the investment in railways. Of course, it was British capital that built railways in Argentina and indeed in the United States in the 19th century. That, of course, was the first industrial revolution. Now here, 200 years later, almost, we're in a situation where, if you believe what they said, Davos, we're going through the fourth industrial revolution, and yet China is investing in 19th century technology. And, they're three industrial revolutions late. Is there, to what extent can 19th century investment and technology work in a 21st century where capital investment is becoming much more diffuse, or has the potential to become more diffuse through financial technology, where manufacturing becomes much more diffuse, where it's not so much the old-fashioned hardware that is driving growth and productivity so much as newfangled software? Basically, is China 200 years behind the game?
Yes and no. Basically, like for example, in all these developing countries in Latin America, Southeast Asia, and Africa, I think, because the economy are so backward, you could say they're 19th century economies, there's a great need for electricity, dams and roads, and Obama announces $7 billion electricity project for Africa. Secondly, China is also stepping to I didn't mention this in my book, of course, but China is stepping to the forefront of the fourth industrial revolution. Like in the G20 summit in Hangzhou, they talk about digital inclusion, where farmers could do e-commerce and banking on their handphones. And some of the Chinese companies, I'm saying this not because Alibaba bought South China Morning Post, but I mean, Alipay is just almost a game changer. It's processing billions and billions of dollars of online payments on the handphones outside traditional banks, which means that in theory they could in future potentially sideline normal banks and central banks around the world.
We had another hand up here.
Chris Potts, Crump and Co. Solicitors. Where does China expect to end up in the medium to long term? Is there a cohesive policy behind this? Or is it of a random nature that has some semblance of Leninism about it?
Well, as I argue in my book, one of the key considerations of the Chinese government is to maintain social stability over the 1.3 billion people. So any foreign policy stance by the Chinese government, whether it's being aggressive and nasty towards Donald Trump or Japan, the ultimate ulterior motive is just to keep the 1.3 billion Chinese people stable. And China is undergoing some very painful economic reforms now, shifting from cheap manufacturing, as I said, the first stage of the Industrial Revolution, to a more consumer-driven economy. There have been many, many articles about how successful or unsuccessful it is, and if, and this is a big if it succeeds, then the world, China's economy in the world will be a better place in maybe 5 years down the road. But that's a big if.
Do we have any more questions? Oh, yeah.
Hi, I'm Joyce Lau. Aside from the business considerations, when a country becomes dominant, and if China is becoming more dominant than the West, there are social and political implications, not just money.
Yes.
In terms of human rights, there's a lot of concern that as China becomes a dominant communicator and investor in places like Africa, that human rights issues be overlooked. They're just not as strict about things like labor and safety and whether things are done fairly. So can you talk a little bit about the non-business aspect of China becoming a colonial power?
Yes, you are absolutely right, and there's no shortage of stories about problems in Chinese overseas investments. Like several years ago, there was an incident in a China Ryan coal mine where I think either the Chinese manager shot some African workers or the other way around, I forget, in Zambia.
Oh my goodness.
And also the latest controversy is this big Chinese state infrastructure firm, China Communication Construction. They're building this 55 billion Malaysian ringgit railway connecting East and West Malaysia, and there's been a lot of criticism of it because they see it, many critics see it as a bailout of the corruption and the fraud and the money laundering in the Malaysian State Fund 1MDB. I do not deny all that, and there was a story I think I mentioned in my book about how China built a hospital in Angola, and shortly after they finished it, all the cracks appeared in the hospital. So nobody could put patients or doctors inside that hospital. I think a lot will depend on the internal governance of each country that receives these investments. If you have a government with strong social responsibility, they will keep a watch on the Chinese companies. And especially in some African countries, like South Africa, I mean, there are many labor unions in many African countries. They will fight hard against abuses of local labor in these countries. And, some African countries have, strict laws, labor union laws, and the labor unions are quite active. Yes.
There's a gentleman at the back.
Hi, thank you. Archie Preston, Altus Capital. Thank you very much for your speech. I wanted to ask a little bit about the question, is China an empire? And specifically, what is the implication of that question, and why should we be asking it? If you think China is an empire, or if you think it's just a country, a powerful country, what are the sort of implications of the answer to that question?
Well, first of all, in today's atmosphere of political correctness, empire is a dirty word. And, as China grows economically and invests more and more overseas, the big question is whether China's money will be seen as a threat, and whether China will be seen as an imperialist threat. One of the chapters in my book talks about how the African English language newspapers perceive China. And the very interesting thing is, from my research of several key African countries with a gamut of range from lots of press freedom to very little press freedom, almost all the articles I came across in the English language press does not describe China as an imperialist or horrible colonialist.
Do we have any more questions from the floor? Oh, at the back.
Thanks. My name's Brad Pepping. I'm with the Australian Consulate. Can you just comment on the pace of capital outflows in China, particularly over the last year, and measures by the Chinese government to stem that, and how that's potentially going to impact on overseas investment?
Yes, you're right. I mean, not all the Chinese company money that goes out of China is clean. I mean, some of it is money laundering. Like if you buy real estate in New York or London, I'm sure a portion of that is money laundering. And there have been efforts by the Chinese government to clamp down on what they see as irrelevant and questionable investments. Like a Chinese company, mining company might, for example, buy a golf course. So they're having all these efforts to stem the outflow of money. But I mean, some of it is in real investments, like, for example, the Malaysian railway project, controversial and questionable it is. They're going to build that railway, and it's going to have geopolitical reasons because it's going to sideline Singapore, and Chinese goods need not go through Singapore.
We have room for one more question. Does anybody have a question? Oh, and that's the last one.
Chris Potts again. Do we have any reason to be concerned about this, unaccompanied by any sort of perceivable military aspirations as it is?
Sorry, can you repeat your question?
Do we have any reason to be concerned about this, the Chinese expansionism and investment abroad, unaccompanied by militarism as it seems to be?
Yes, I mean, for example, their posture in the South China Sea is creating a lot of room for concern. And, you know, you can say that China is in a very subtle and insidious way encroaching even on Hong Kong and South China Sea through all kinds of insidious projects. But interestingly, you know, the Chinese state press recently said China is not really ready to step up to the plate as a global economic power yet, It still needs America to set the global framework. And China cannot replace America in setting the global rules of the game. This was mentioned in Chinese state media editorials.
Any more questions? Okay, I think that's it. Thank you for an insightful talk, Toh Han Shih. I'd just like to remind everyone that his book is available for sale today, and also a token of our appreciation.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.